and what a pleasure it is to be able to speak to BAM members and to meet old friends like Marie and David. And I hope that what I have to say will have some resonance with your own research interests and concerns. Today it's about organizational becoming, but I'm actually a little surprised at the if you might use the word career of this concept, organizational becoming, which I introduced together with Harry Sukas more than 2 decades ago, and I'm sort of quite intrigued by its fortunes, so to speak. It's become more and more an accepted a phrase, if you might, in the management and organization studies literature. So I want to say a little bit more about it, but I want to suggest to you that first of all, as Murray has alluded to, I came from industry. I came from the business world, not knowing anything about much of this management and organization theory and so forth. And the whole idea was simply just to try and understand some of the predicaments that I face as a business practitioner. And that was the reason for me giving up a reasonably successful career in business to come into academia to try and find some answers to these puzzling questions. I take it that as academics, our main task is to try to describe as accurately as possible what's going on in the world of organizations, of management, and so forth, and then to try to offer some kind of explanation for why things happen the way they do and the consequences and outcomes of these actions that we take. But in this regard, I have found a persistent dissonance, if you might, somehow my own personal observations and my understanding of going-ons in the world of business and organizations seem to be at odds with a lot of what is written in the management literature, extant management literature at large. So that has prompted me to try to figure out why this dissonance exists, and increasingly, over the last, now it's 35 years now, since I've got into academia, I've begun to realize that it has a lot to do with how we think about the world, and perhaps the term worldview may be an appropriate way of understanding these differences. And so my interest as an academic has become more and more involved with trying to understand how worldviews are inherited, so to speak, and how they affect the way we theorize and understand phenomena in the world, including especially organizational phenomena. So the idea of organizational becoming is, if you might, an output of trying to think differently from the conventional approaches that one sees in the management and organization theory literature. So is this search for this alternative way of thinking? When I came into academia, or I think stumbled would be the better word. I stumbled into academia in the late 1980s, searching for some explanation, so to speak. One of the most, I had a very good PhD supervisor, and I was introduced to the work of a philosopher called Alfred North Whitehead. And they were reading his Adventures of Ideas. This passage sort of captivated me. In each age of the world, there's a general form of the forms of thought that, like the air we breathe, is so translucent and so pervasive and so seemingly necessary that only by extreme effort can we become aware of it. This is another way of understanding what we call paradigm today. But, you know, changing paradigms is not like changing shirts. It takes, there's agony, there's pain, there's loss in letting go as well. But what these paradigms of comprehension do is that they actually direct our observations. You know, we inherit an observational order that points us to certain discriminations in this otherwise disorderly world, and we inherit a conceptual order through which we interpret. So the idea that there are impartial facts, there are objective facts out there, to me, is actually fundamentally wrong. We fabricate our facts, as I will argue in later on in my presentation. So we select and we discard certain aspects of our experiences, and we rearrange that which we select into a what Whitehead calls a subjective order of prominence. You know, we create order out of it. And so if we have a different way of ordering the world, different way of thinking about the world, we order the world accordingly to the way we think. And that is the reason why my own thinking, it seemed to me, was at odds with a lot of the academic theorizing that I had actually encountered. So my project, I suppose, as you say, over the last 30 over years, has been to try to figure out how to rewrite and to be more true, in my view, to the lived experiences of practitioners in the world in organizations, and how organizations become the way they are. So this means basically this preoccupation has resulted in a series of publications over the last 3 decades, beginning with something called postmodernism. But I don't use the word anymore because I actually think it's such a confused term. For me, postmodernism equates processual thinking. There was a paper I read a long time ago called Heraclitus, the postmodern pre-Socratic, you know, and I thought to myself, that is a wonderful title because it shows that postmodern is not after modern. As we know, Heraclitus was 2,500 years ago, and yet he was a postmodern pre-Socratic, according to this paper. And so for me, postmodern means process. I could say more about it as in Derrida, where he talks about post as being in post, in circulation, rather than post as after. Anyway, so sticking to this idea of postmodern as process led me to writing a piece in 1999, actually, in the British Academy of Management, called a rhizomic model of organizational change, perspectives from metaphysics of change. So it's about what would the implications be if we adopted a metaphysics of process and change? How would we view organizational change? And this again inspired the next paper, which I wrote with Harry Sukas in Oak Science, where we actually formally introduced the term organizational becoming. And this is how, and this was in 2002. So that's what, 21 years ago now, how time flies. And more recently, I've tried to sort of elaborate on the consequences of understanding organizational becoming in terms of silent transformation and so forth. This is in the Journal of Change Management. So all these attempts to try to articulate a different way of understanding organizational progress and functioning, and to capture something which I feel is missing in much of the extant literature. You know, when you read a lot of the textbooks and stuff like that, there is a certain kind of confident assuredness, a kind of certainty about how to act in various definable situations and so forth. But you know, life is not like that. Life is actually quite tortured. Life is contested, so to speak. There are pulls and pushes, and even when we make a decision, the decision is never a straightforward thing. It is always with a lot of proving and what is missing in a lot of our theorizing is an expression, expressions of doubt, you know, of hesitancy, of uncertainty, of the kind of agonizing that is going on before, during, and after actions and decisions. You know, the kind of conflicting emotions. Think about the strikes at the moment going on with the nurses and the ambulance and the train. You know, their decisions are not so straightforward. They have to, before they go to the picket line, they have to think to themselves, what is the consequence and cost of this? Will I have enough? Can I afford to do this? Because, you know, I will have pay deducted and whatever. Will my children suffer as a consequence of it? So on one hand, I have to strike because there's a matter of principle. On the other hand, there's a price to it. Decisions are like that. On the other side of the fence, the government also has contestations, you know. Will acceding to the union's demands, will it cause inflationary effects and so forth? What can we afford it? What will the consequence be? Ramifications? There's contestation. So life in any organized context is about push and pull, about contestations, conflicting demands. It is struggles. They are never straightforward. So this is how organizations become. This is how we become. You know, without resistance, there's nothing to push and pull again, and there's no actual advancement and progress. So paradoxically, you need the resistance in order to develop, so to speak. So this is the way of thinking that I find more resonant with how we live our lives and how organizations develop, progress, and become successful, decline, and then renew themselves and so forth. Okay, so it is a rejection of this kind of more linearized way of understanding the world, which I call a metaphysics of substance, or metaphysics of being, which makes assumption that reality is discrete, atomistic, stable, simply a succession of instantaneous configurations of matter. In other words, you have A, then you have B, then you have C, and so forth, you know, and neither one of these interfere with the other. That's the basic assumption that is being made. Even today, it is part of Newtonian physics, and we still carry them with us. The idea then becomes change is understood as epiphenomenal. It is something that happens to things. Things change. Change is transient, episodic, and epiphenomenal, you know. So likewise, organizations are also like that. There are organizations are like things. They change, but they are essentially stable entities with fixed identities. The University of Glasgow, for example, is a fixed thing. It's all the buildings and all the what, and it changes. Well, this is one way of thinking about it. My understanding of the University of Glasgow is not about the bricks. It's not about the buildings. It's not about the constitution and so forth. Actually, it's a lot more than that. It's about the people and the interactions and the practices that we have inherited. That's what it is. Organizational change, according to this metaphysics of substance, requires external intervention. This derives from Newton's first law of motion, which actually says that if every body continues in its state of rest or of uniform motion in a straight line, except so far as it may be compelled by force to change that state. In other words, you need external intervention to change. I'm sure most of you will have come across Lewin's idea of a model of change, unfreeze, change, refreeze. You have to intervene in order to make change happen. Well, I will suggest to you that according to a metaphysics of process, which I will introduce in a little while, in a minute, change can actually happen of its own volition. We do not need to introduce and impose change. Change can be natural, so to speak. So if we embrace a alternative metaphysics of process of becoming, this is what happens. Again, it's inspired by the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, but many others as well, like Andre Bergson and his ideas of creative evolution. Things and states are only views taken by our mind of becoming. So becoming is the reality. And becoming implies the continuous progress of the past, which gnaws into the future and which swells as it advances. In other words, history, tradition, continuity of the past in the present. That is the reality of life. They are not discrete units that have nothing to do with each other. Okay, this is the way to think about. So when you look at an outcome, the outcome has got historical implications, so to speak. This way of thinking process, of change, of flux and transformation, this way of thinking has been around for thousands of years. 2,500 years ago, Heraclitus in the West made a number of cryptic statements like this one, that you never step into the same river twice and so forth, But it is not only Heraclitus. It is also in the Oriental world. 5,000 years ago, there was the beginnings of a book called the Book of Change. It's not a book of stability. It's a book of change. And subsequently, in Oriental thought, it has influenced this idea that reality is ultimately process and change. There is no piling up. Interestingly, there is a revival of interest in this idea of a processual reality. And in theoretical physics, for example, David Bohm has used this as a basis for his quantum interpretation. The Nobel Prize winner Ilya Prigogine also has embraced this metaphysics of becoming, a philosophy of instability, in his philosophy of instability. If you're interested, these are the people who are now showing us that becoming as a worldview is a better way of understanding phenomena in the world. But what are key premises of this process and becoming worldview? That reality is an undivided process of creative becoming, novelty. Every change always produces novelty, unexpected novelty. That facts are fabrications. If you go back to the Latin roots of the word fact, They derive from two Latin roots, factum and facere, both of which means to fabricate. So facts are fabrications. Fabrication doesn't mean that you create them out of nothing. It means that you have raw material and you fabricate them in a particular way. And why do we do so? To help us get a grip on reality. Because as you will see, a fluxing reality is no good for us. Organizations are relatively stabilized patterns of interactions and relationships. They are not things. Organizational change happens unowned, meaning to say change happens of its own volition, ongoing, even without any intentional intervention. Furthermore, the work of organizing begins from a point, and it radiates outwards. But it doesn't even radiate outwards in a linear fashion. It radiates outward heterogeneously. And in the paper that I wrote about rhizomic change, it's rhizomic. It goes like water flowing, seeking its own level of stability. That's how processual change happens. But this idea of reality being fluxing and changing and becoming is actually very unnerving. It is unlivable. Humans need stability. We need stability. So the only way we can achieve some modicum of stability from this processual, fluxing, changing totality is through our practices. So socio-cultural practices have been forged through generations, through our forebears, transmitted to us to help fix or stabilize temporarily this fluxing reality to make it more livable. So practices are shared practices that enable us to make life livable. So things, events, and states are simply cognitive abstractions, and they are necessary because we have to fix elements, aspects of this fluxing reality to create a surrogate social reality. This word surrogate social reality actually comes from Carl Weick's work, which I have borrowed from him. I should have attributed to him. So, but reality, ultimate reality is a blooming, buzzing confusion. But what we need to do and what we do in various cultures, and using language and actions and so forth, is to carve out into neat categories. And so we cut out times, days and nights, summers and winters, and all these abstract words are basically concepts. So fundamentally, our practices are meant to regularize our experiences, share experiences, to make it into stable portions so that we can create meaning and communication, and from there have meaningful and productive social exchange. So everyday coping practices are basically the building blocks of our social reality. These coping actions, the multitude of them, aggregate into shared social cultural practices containing a modus operandi. I think that would be maybe a better word. Habitus is simply a way of engaging and dealing with the world, and there's a consistency in it because they are aggregated from past coping actions. And the reason why we aggregate them is because they have proven effective in the past. So habitus ensures this non-deliberate consistency of coping responses. It is, in fact, to use Bourdieu's term, it is actually strategic without a strategic intention. Habits can be useful in achieving an outcome without it needing having to have a kind of pre-thought plan. What is the purpose? The purpose is to achieve some kind of a comfort fit with the environment to conserve energy. You know, human species, like all the species, ultimately, it's about the important thing is about conservation of energy in order to save this energy for further exploration and expansion of our what Salins and Service call our degrees of freedom, expansion of our degrees of freedom. So organizations are not entities. They are simply stabilized bundles of habituated practices geared towards economy of effort. This is how organizational orders eventuate. So if you look at modern society, if you look at language, if you look at money, if you look at medieval cities, how did they come about? Did anybody plan for them? Not quite like Milton Keynes, which was planned. But most of the medieval cities, most languages just evolve and develop by their own self. Every step and every movement of the multitudes are made with equal blindness to the future. And they are indeed the effects of human action, but not the execution of any human design. But how do you achieve order out of even when there's no deliberate planning intention? Well, through local sensitivity and knowledge. Okay, there's a wonderful book by James Scott called "Seeing Like a State," and he talks about how when the European settlers landed in New England, they wanted to cultivate corn, but they didn't know when to plant, so they had to sort out from the Native Americans, and the Native Americans gave them a kind of litany of when to what to observe, and to observe when the skunk cabbage appears, the willow begins to leave, the red-winged blackbird returning, the first hatch of the mayfly. When all these things happen, then you know it's time to plant the corn. This is local knowledge. This is called James Scott calls it metistic knowledge. I'll say more about this in a minute. So characteristics of practical coping action initiated by the senses, observation, fidelity of observation. We have traditionally, particularly for those of us who have educated in the West and so forth, we have tended to follow the Platonic model where we have elevated the intellect over the senses. But in this kind of practical coping, it is the senses that is the initiating point for our understanding of the world. So observational fidelity to seeking out situational affordances. Métis, Détienne and Vernon call Métis, I think it's a bit harsh. They call it cunning intelligent, but you know, cunning gives it a kind of negative connotation. It's intelligence has the ability to reverse disadvantage into an advantage. That's the important thing about Métis. To turn a situation or neutral situation into an advantageous, and it's advantage gaining, basically, to give us a grip to anchor our effective action. It's a form of wayfinding. You don't yet know. As you are groping around, you try to figure out how to cope with the circumstance you find yourself in. And ultimately, it is to reduce tension with the environment and the situation you find yourself in by creating what Dreyfus calls a satisfactory gestalt. In other words, it's about reducing tension. My co-author and I, Robin Holt, have just are writing a paper at the moment called where we talk about intention not as something mental, but intention as the relieving of tension between the organism and its environment. So Métis can produce very simple, effective solutions. I'm sure many of you who go walking in the countryside in this part of the world will recognize this. These are cattle grid. You know, cattle grids are wonderful. They encompass a very simple insight and principle. A cattle has 4 legs. Four-legged animals can't coordinate their 4 legs, so they get trapped in this cattle grid. For us, we have no problems. Cars, no problems. So this cattle grid is so wonderful, it acts as a kind of invisible gate. The cattle no longer, after a few falling into the trap a few times, they resist crossing. So it becomes a deterrent, and you have a very effective invisible gate that is not a gate. How? Because the farmers have observed the inadequacies of these 4-legged animals, and they are able to pick up the difference. We can cross, but animals can't cross. It's a difference that makes a difference. And this is Gregory Bateson's phrase about information. What is information? Information is difference that makes a difference. So Métis is an essential coping skill. But in order to understand what is Métis, we go back to Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics. He differentiates between 4 different types of knowledge. Sophia, which is this kind of abstract intellectual wisdom. Episteme, which is a kind of knowledge that you and I as academics mostly write about in the books. Episteme is what we are more familiar with. Techne is craft skill, craft capability. Phronesis is practical wisdom. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Solomon and the baby and the two mothers who both claim that they are the mothers of this baby. And Solomon says, okay, if that's the case, both of you insist that you are both, let's cut the baby into half. And then one of the women says, no, let her have it. And of course, that reveals to Solomon that she must be the mother, because the mother would rather give away the baby than have the baby being killed. That's phronesis for you. But what is Métis? Aristotle never talked about Métis at all. But Métis is found in Homer's Iliad, even well before Aristotle. And this is what Detian and Vernon calls it. It's a kind of cunning intelligence. And there's a story in Homer's Iliad where he talks about the chariot race, and this young boy, using cunning intelligence, was able to defeat the king of Sparta. So it's about detecting differences that make a difference, about learning to gain advantage through small incremental changes. Frequently relying on internal momentum and shifting configurations. It accepts that situations are not static. They are constantly evolving, and at each moment of the evolution, there are points in which you can actually take advantage. So organizational change and becoming, from this point of view, is about detection of affordances. It's about through very extensive and intensive engagements. It's about timing and timeliness of intervention. It's not the force of intervention, how much effort you put. It's about when you intervene. In the Oriental mentality, there's a phrase that the Chinese use. They say, "Pluck a fruit only when it is ripe." You know, you don't pluck a fruit before it is ripened. When you pluck a fruit and is ripe, it comes off very easily. And these interventions are always oblique, circuitous, understated insertions, quiet insertions. They are not disruptive, they are not spectacular, they are not jarring, and they rely on Matisse. So it's a bit like this, drip, drip, drip. Small little drip, 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 aggregating into big things. My colleague at Strathclyde University and I have just finished our book on that discusses some of these aspects in a book called Strategy in Practices. And this will be out next month. So I've rushed through a little bit. Thank you very much, and thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions and clarifications if you need.